Outside of a federal building in Minneapolis as Homeland Security warns of escalating attacks on ICE agents. The senior correspondent, Steve Harrigan, live in Minneapolis with the latest from there. Steve.
Kevin, that protest out in front of the federal building in Minneapolis turned violent after protesters were told to disperse. At least 42 people were arrested when they were told they had to break it up. Many began throwing bottles and ice at the federal agents.
This is a prosecutorial analysis of the federal occupation of Minnesota. Tonight, we look at the gap between the rhetoric of the Trump administration and the forensic reality on the ground. We will examine the fatal shootings of citizens, the conditions of detention, and the legal framework being used to bypass state authority. This is the record of Operation Metro Surge. Donald Trump claims that Alex Priddy was an insurrectionist who was killed while attacking federal agents. That is a lie. This administration further claims that the detention conditions at the Bishop Henry Whipple Federal Building meet the highest standards of professional care. That is also a lie. The Department of Homeland Security claims that its agents follow all protocols and always identify themselves during operations. According to multiple eyewitnesses and local officials, that is a lie. The administration is using these falsehoods to justify a campaign of organized brutality against the people of Minnesota. Here, play this clip.
My co-founder and I stopped by a restaurant on our street and ended up filling to-go orders for them because more than 50% of his staff is gone. Afraid to come to work for fear of being taken by ICE, even as U.S. citizens, even with work permits, even with the right paperwork.
We've lived through this before during COVID in 2020 following the murder of George Floyd, and we're living through it again, and this time it's worse.
On February 1st, 2026, Donald Trump described Alex Priddy, a 37-year-old nurse who was shot dead by federal agents, as an agitator and perhaps insurrectionist. Trump claimed that Priddy was involved in a scuffle with federal agents and was shooting back. This claim was echoed by White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller and DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, who labeled victims of federal shootings as domestic terrorists and professional agitators. Noem stated on February 8th that any claim of subprime conditions at the Whipple building is false. She claimed that ensuring the well-being of individuals in custody is a top priority. These statements were made to the press to provide a veneer of lawfulness to an operation that has resulted in the deaths of 2 American citizens and the detention of hundreds more in conditions described by medical professionals as dehumanizing. Here, play this clip.
700 ICE agents were pulled out on Wednesday. That still leaves 2,000 here. So far, no public timeline on when they will be leaving.
The evidence does not support the administration's claims. Forensic analysis of the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Priddy reveals a pattern of lethal force used against nonviolent or non-threatening individuals. Video evidence from bystanders and even from the agents themselves shows that Renee Good was inoffensive and stated, "I'm not mad at you, dude," seconds before she was executed. She was a mother of 3 and a Christian who had performed mission work. There is no evidence she was a domestic terrorist. Here, play this clip.
We're not talking about running around to some office building or some restaurant. We're talking about getting the worst of the worst out of this country, off the streets, and no longer a danger to its citizens.
Well, you're absolutely right. Look, the president's decision to send Tom in it was a stroke of genius, and Tom has been able to go in over this past week or more.
In the case of Alex Priddy, ProPublica identified the agents who fired their weapons as Border Patrol agent Jesus Ochoa and CBP officer Raimundo Gutierrez. While the government released a video allegedly showing Priddy in a scuffle, the footage only shows a man kicking a car's taillight before agents tackle him. There is no evidence Priddy was an insurrectionist or that he was shooting back, as Trump claimed. Regarding the conditions at the Whipple Federal Building, United States Representative Kelly Morrison, who is also a doctor, conducted a site visit. Her forensic report contradicts Secretary Noem's claims. Morrison found that the facility has no specific medical policy and no medical care on site. There was no nurse present during her visit. Detainees are being held in extremely cold temperatures. They are sleeping on concrete floors with nothing but temporary tinfoil blankets. Morrison observed people in locked cells wearing leg shackles with minimal food access. This evidence proves that the facility is operating outside of standard humanitarian and medical protocols for detention. Further evidence of procedural failure is found in the administration's own press briefings. Secretary Noem stood before posters of 4 individuals to justify the thousands of arrests made under Operation Metro Surge. Here, play this clip.
Because then that cooperation can continue. But if you see a spike in some of the violent activity there, DHS is going to, it's going to protect its officers. And so those resources, the 2,000 or so that remain, are likely not going anywhere if that violence continues.
Absolutely. And you have to do what you can and what you obviously are required to do, and that is protect this country from those who might harm us. And by the way, for the record, you mentioned Tom Holman. He's obviously also working now with counties.
The individuals were Aldrin Guaniro Munoz, Jose Hernandez Raz, Francisco Garcia Olivia, and David Gonzalez Rivas. While these individuals have serious criminal histories, including homicide and sexual assault, the government is using their cases to paint a false picture of the other 515,000 people who have been arrested and deported nationwide. Noem admitted that the government is also targeting people for visa fraud through Operation Twin Shield, which involves individuals who simply overstayed or had incorrect paperwork. This proves the administration is conflating violent criminals with administrative violators to manipulate public perception. Evidence from the streets of Minneapolis also refutes the claim that agents always identify themselves. Multiple witnesses in St. Paul reported that agents did not identify themselves during the detention of workers at a local company. When questioned about this, Noem and her agents simply repeated that they follow protocols, failing to provide any specific rebuttal to the eyewitness accounts. In another instance, the administration denied that children were zip-tied during a raid in Idaho, calling it a fake story. Yet they offered no evidence to disprove the multiple parent testimonies reporting the incident. Operation Metro Surge is a demonstration of federal power exerted to override state sovereignty and civil liberties. The deployment of 3,000 ICE officers to Minnesota was done over the objections of the governor and the mayor of Minneapolis. This is an attempt to erode the Posse Comitatus Act of 1888, which prohibits using federal troops for local law enforcement. By using the National Guard to protect ICE agents who are not properly considered law enforcement in a traditional sense, the administration is creating a paramilitary force loyal to the executive branch rather than the law. The administration is also exerting control over the legislative branch. Secretary Noem enacted a policy requiring members of Congress to give 7 days' notice before visiting detention facilities. This was a direct attempt to prevent oversight. When Representatives Ilhan Omar, Betty McCollum, and Kelly Morrison attempted to visit the Whipple building, they were initially denied entry. A judge eventually had to issue a temporary restraining order to block Noem's policy, but the delay allowed the administration to maintain control over the narrative of the facility's conditions. Control is also being exerted through the weaponization of the Department of Justice. Attorney General Pam Bondi has announced the arrest of over 150 protesters in Minnesota. These individuals are being charged with federal felonies, including FACE Act violations and conspiracy. The use of the FACE Act, originally designed to protect access to reproductive health clinics against people protesting at a church where an ICE official is a pastor, is a significant expansion of federal prosecutorial power. By charging journalists like Don Lemon with conspiracy for covering these protests, the administration is attempting to control the information flow and intimidate the press. Finally, the administration is using economic pressure as a tool of control. Small businesses in Minneapolis report that the federal presence is worse for the economy than the COVID-19 pandemic. Business owners are losing staff who are afraid to come to work, even if they have legal status, for fear of being detained by ICE. Instead of addressing the fear, the administration uses it to justify further arrests, creating a feedback loop of intimidation that destabilizes the local community and forces compliance. The government's strongest defense is that they are merely enforcing established laws to protect public safety. They argue that the individuals being removed are the worst of the worst, including murderers, rapists, and gang members. They claim that state officials like Governor Walz and Mayor Frey are failing to defend their citizens by refusing to honor ICE detainers, thereby forcing federal agents to go out into the streets to find dangerous criminals. This defense is dismantled by the law and the facts. While the government highlights 4 specific violent criminals, they admit that 70% of those arrested nationwide have only pending charges or are being removed for administrative reasons like visa fraud. The government cannot use the crimes of a few to justify the systematic violation of the Fourth Amendment rights of thousands of others. Furthermore, the The claim that agents were shooting back in self-defense is not supported by the available video evidence, which shows no weapons were brandished by the victims. The government also argues that the protests are not peaceful and that law enforcement officers have been demonized, leading to a 1,000% increase in violence against them. They use the Operation Dildo Blitz protest, where sex toys were thrown at vehicles, as evidence of an unlawful assembly and a threat to public safety. However, throwing a rubber object does not constitute a violent felony that justifies the mass arrest of 54 people. The government's own evidence of violence includes protesters shouting insults and tearing down police tape. This is not an insurrection. It is protected, albeit uncivil, dissent. The administration is conflating property damage and insults with terrorism to justify the suspension of constitutional rights. It is necessary to understand the legal definitions being manipulated here. 18 U.S.C. Section 111 is the federal statute that punishes anyone who forcibly assaults, resists, opposes, impedes, intimidates, or interferes with federal officials. The administration is interpreting interfering so broadly that it includes journalists filming arrests or citizens asking agents for identification. This is a departure from the intent of the law, which is meant to protect officers from physical harm, not from public scrutiny. The Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances FACE Act is also being misused. This law prohibits the use of force or intimidation to interfere with a person's right to religious freedom at a place of worship. The DOJ is using this to indict 9 people for chanting "ICE out" during a church service. While interrupting a service is a local disturbance, elevating it to a federal civil rights conspiracy is an unprecedented use of the statute to silence political speech. Furthermore, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution guarantees state sovereignty. Minnesota is currently arguing in court that the federal government's unilateral deployment of agents violates this amendment. Under our system of federalism, the federal government does not have unlimited, quote, police power. That power is reserved for the states. When the federal government conducts mass arrests for local offenses like, quote, failing to disperse, they are encroaching on state authority. Finally, the 1888 Posse Comitatus Act is a critical protection against the domestic use of the military. The administration is attempting to bypass this by using the National Guard under federal control to, quote, protect ICE agents. This creates a legal gray area where military force is used to perform civilian law enforcement tasks, which is exactly what the act was designed to prevent. The professional judgment on this administration is clear. They are unfit to exercise the power of federal law enforcement. A government that shoots its own citizens for, quote, kicking a taillight and then labels them insurrectionists has abandoned the rule of law. A government that holds people in, quote, dehumanizing conditions without medical care while publicly claiming those conditions are, quote, humane is a government that has lost its moral authority. The administration's tactics are designed to manufacture a crisis. By deploying thousands of agents into a community, they provoke a reaction. When the community reacts, they use that reaction to justify more agents and more arrests. This is not law and order. It is a cycle of state-sponsored provocation. The use of inflammatory language like Gestapo and Nazis by state officials, while arguably accurate in terms of the tactics observed, has been used by the federal government as a pretext to claim they are being demonized and are thus the victims. The psychological cost of this behavior is profound. A society cannot remain mentally healthy when it is told not to trust its own eyes and ears. The constant chaos and the normalization of cruelty erode the internal sense of reality for all citizens. When power is exercised without restraint, it results in a collective psychological assault that manifests as panic, dread, and despair. An administration that prioritizes ideology over human dignity and truth is an administration that is fundamentally broken. We must look to the credentials of those sounding the alarm. Representative Kelly Morrison is not just a politician. She is a medical doctor who provided a professional assessment of the dehumanizing conditions at the Whipple building. Her clinical observations of locked cells in leg shackles and no medical care on site carry the weight of professional expertise. Conversely, look at the authorities directing this operation. Sam Westbay and David Eastwood are acting officials. They are leading agents who are allegedly refusing to identify themselves during operations. Tom Homan, the border czar, is a political appointee who has admitted that the reduction of agents is contingent on the lawfulness of protesters, effectively using the threat of force to suppress the right to assemble. Attorney General Pam Bondi is using social media to announce more arrests to come before trials have even begun, showing a total disregard for the presumption of innocence. Human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and the Committee to Protect Journalists have also weighed in. They have condemned the arrests of journalists and the scale of the violence being used against demonstrators. These are the expert voices that describe a government operating outside the bounds of international and domestic norms. The institutions of our government are currently failing to provide a check on this power. The Department of Justice is acting as the enforcement arm of a political ideology rather than an independent seeker of justice. Attorney General Bondi's rhetoric suggests that the DOJ is more interested in quashing protests than in protecting the constitutional rights of the protesters. The courts have also been slow to act. While a judge blocked the 7-day notice policy for congressional visits, other courts have denied the state of Minnesota's request for an injunction to stop Operation Metro Surge. This institutional delay has allowed the federal government to continue its operations while the legal challenges slowly move through the system. Congress is being blocked from performing its oversight duty. The initial denial of entry to the Whipple building for elected representatives is a direct attack on the institutional balance of power. When the executive branch can successfully hide its actions from the legislative branch, accountability becomes impossible. Furthermore, local law enforcement agencies are being divided. While the governor and mayor oppose the operations, the federal government is bypassing them to meet with the Minnesota Sheriff's Association. By creating unprecedented cooperation with local sheriffs, the federal government is effectively recruiting local institutions to help them bypass state-level leadership. This is a deliberate strategy to fracture the institutions of the state to maintain federal control. The procedural consequences of these actions are now being determined in the courts. On Tuesday, a judge will decide whether any of the 42 protesters arrested outside the federal building will be released on bail. These individuals face potential years in federal prison for charges that include obstruction and conspiracy. Don Lemon and the 8 other protesters from the church incident are scheduled for a hearing in Minneapolis on February 9th. The outcome of this case will set a precedent for whether covering a protest can be prosecuted as a civil rights violation. The lawsuit by the state of Minnesota and the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul will continue to argue the 10th Amendment violation. This case will likely ascend to the higher courts to determine the limits of federal authority in a state that has explicitly demanded the federal government leave. For the people of Minnesota, the immediate procedural reality is a continued federal presence. Despite the removal of 700 agents, 2,000 remain on the ground with no public timeline for their departure. The Operation Metro Surge continues, and the administration has warned that any impeding will lead to further arrests. The process is one of sustained escalation. This is the evidence. These are the laws. This is the accountability. We will continue to monitor the record. This content reflects my personal opinion and analysis based on publicly available information. It is not intended to promote hate, harassment, or harm toward any individual, group, or political party. The purpose of this video is news commentary, critical analysis, and public discussion under fair use. If you want deeper context, verified sources, and clearer breakdowns of these political developments, watch the related videos on this channel. I don't do surface-level takes here. Subscribe and explore the full playlist to understand the complete picture, not just headlines.